virtual reality is a gimmick. This discussion on the steady evolution and then sudden halt of technological progress VR has had has been an ongoing thought in my mind I've pondered about for well over 3 years now, way before I even got my first headset back in 2020. The inevitable direction VR is heading and where it should be heading. The logical and technical stuff, like its strengths and extreme deal-breaking weaknesses, but mainly why it's been and always will be, in my opinion, sort of a gimmick. A great gimmick, don't get me wrong, and gimmicks can be nice sometimes, like the 3D effect in 3DS, just to name one, but it's a gimmick nonetheless. But I've always been a true believer of VR ever since about 2018 or 2017, and trust me, it has definitely come a long way. But I believe it peaked in 2019 in terms of popularity and impressive accomplishments. With the release of the Index, Rift S, Quest, Boneworks, and of course the massive announcement of Half-Life Alyx, which made every headset pretty much go out of stock. The hype was surreal and unforgettable. It felt like VR truly finally became something revolutionary and special back then. But it's been 4 years since 2019, and virtual reality really hasn't moved or changed or improved in the slightest. I'm going to start this video with talking about the hardware and the history behind said hardware. VR has always been something somewhat prevalent in the gaming scene, the Virtual Boy being a great example, but we all know how that went. But when VR really started taking off was when a small company called Oculus made a development kit for their upcoming VR headset, the Rift. The DK1 got into the hands of some companies, YouTubers, and game developers, and there were some games created for it too, like Dreadhalls, my personal favorite old VR game. About a year later, the DK2 released and was a massive improvement over the original, using a 75Hz refresh rate OLED screen and having half-decent head tracking. Now, Oculus was getting ready to release the consumer version, the official Rift, for the public, until HTC came out of nowhere and detonated a massive nuke in the VR industry called the Vive. Now, stupid Oculus users over there had to use an Xbox controller to play games with because the controllers that were promised to release at launch got delayed. Looking back retrospectively, it is debatable that the Rift is better than the Vive, but back then, people who pre-ordered the Rift had to wait 9 whole months to get their promised hand presence controllers, while at the meantime, Vive owners were flouncing their headsets, having the time of their life with their Vive wands tracked via base stations. 2016 was the true beginning of virtual reality. A few games were available to the public back then: Superhot, Job Simulator, I Expected to Die, Arizona Sunshine, and The Climb, but none of these games were really that good. Jump to 3 years later, the Rift S and Quest release. The Rift S being a hardcore PC dedicated headset, and the Quest being a standalone headset that was capable of running PC games but less reliably, while at the same time being a budget option. Both were fantastic options, creating both a brand new demographic of VR users and one destroying the Rift and the Vive. But then the Valve Index released, and people thought, yeah, this is pretty good. Not a mind-blowingly incredible headset, but the most a premium experience you can get back in 2019. It freaked out people by how good it was. Boneworks kept being teased, becoming one of the most wish-listed games on Steam consistently for months and months.
Boneworks is in the top 40 most wish-listed games on all of Steam.
And then Valve was just like, oh yeah, by the way, Half-Life 3 is releasing in 4 months, and it's VR only, and we just conveniently dropped a $1,000 VR headset, and here's the trailer. Have fun. And then everyone forgot about Boneworks. Thankfully, Boneworks had already had a set-in-stone release for December before the Alyx reveal in November, so it still did really great in sales and got a lot of YouTubers' attention, but Half-Life was the reason why everyone was buying a VR headset at the time. It was the next entry in the Half-Life franchise, and it had to be good, and yeah, it was good. It's like a 7.5 or an 8 out of 10 game, but no masterpiece. Then, in October of 2020, the Quest 2 released and made VR accessible to the public for the first time in, well, ever. But how is VR holding up today? It hasn't changed. You see, going from the original Rift to the Quest 2, or the Vive to the Valve Index, is a mind-blowing advancement in technology, but there hasn't been a very clear step up from the generation of headsets in 2019 yet. Besides, well, the Quest 2, which released 2.5 years ago. The Index is great, but the Quest 2 comes close in capabilities and performance when connected to a PC. The Reverb G2 is fantastic looking, but the headset's the only good thing about it, and the PSVR 2 is just doing its own thing, I guess. And HTC, the first company that had a massive impact on VR, they've been sucking for years since their first headset. Virtual reality really hasn't changed at all since 2019, and it's extremely disappointing. There's been rumors about a Steam Deck compatible standalone headset releasing soon by Valve, but we'll see how that pans out. But comparing the progress from 2013 to 2015, 2015 to 2019 to 2019 to 2023, there's nothing impressive at all. I mean, come on. Using a DK1 where the display sucks and you can only move your head, to using a Vive where you can have 6 degrees of freedom, hand presence, and impressive visuals, to the Index, those jumps are incredible. But there hasn't been a jump after that. Not yet, at least. VR really just peaked in 2019. Half-Life Alyx got announced, we had 3 fantastic headsets released, perfectly accompanying every single demographic. The hardcore, the average, and the budget. 2019 was it. But everything's the same as it was back then, or possibly worse. Before I get to the meat of the video, the technological, logical engineering, and future of VR state, and all that complicated brainy stuff, games. In my opinion, virtual reality is just another method of playing video games. It's a source of entertainment, a novelty. But how many good games are there? Why should you spend $400 plus on a VR headset? Well, to be an actual VR game, in my eyes at least, it needs to be a dedicated VR exclusive. Ports don't count. And games that are just flat-screen games with shoehorned VR support don't count as actual VR games either. It has to be a game made and designed from VR from the ground up. And when you apply that shockingly strict filter to the VR catalog, there's only a few I'd even recommend to people or declare good. Just a heads up, the games I'm about to list aren't in any particular order, but if you want to know what would be the best one, if I haven't said it enough, it's Boneworks, obviously. Speaking of which, Boneworks is, in my opinion, the best game ever made for virtual reality, and also my favorite game of all time. Funny how that works out. Its campaign is linear, sandbox-heavy, and extremely easy in design. It has a weak, lore-based story that is absolutely not for everybody. A lot of people can't even play it. I mean, look at this. Jeez, I'm not surprised why many people get motion sick by it. I'd love to make a review of this game, but I can't because this guy put every ongoing thought I've ever had on the game perfectly onto paper, and I'm unable to keep up with anything that hasn't already been said by him. So if you want a Boneworks video, go watch that video. It's excellent, it's better than anything I've ever made, and it's so good that I refuse to ever make a review of my literal favorite game of all time. It's just that good of a video. I highly recommend, just go watch it, top right corner. Alright. Beat Saber is an absolute joyous time sink that directly injects my cerebral cortex with syringes filled with artificially made dopamine boosters. Although, without mods it sucks, and modding is one of the biggest pains I've ever had in gaming, making it not even worth a recommend. But, I mean, if you're willing to have an aneurysm to play this game, I mean, it's up to you in the long run. I do think it's worth it, but I wouldn't recommend it. Half-Life Alyx is one of the very few video games you can actually find in the VR catalog of games. As you know, most VR games are short, shallow experiences, non-immersive, bare bones in gameplay or detail, or just shoehorned support for a flat-screen game. Alyx, on the other hand, is a VR game. It has a lengthy, satisfying campaign with excellent level design, breathtaking graphics that look truly next-gen, great horror since anything scary is translated beautifully into VR, great music since it's a Half-Life title, and best of all, it's a Half-Life game by Valve. It's a great game in concept, but it's held back from being fantastic by its shallow immersion. Because yes, it looks amazing, yes, it looks sprawling, yes, it's detail and rich in role building and environmental detail, but it doesn't feel sprawling, and you can't really explore the world since it's extremely linear and restricting, and it's a great game, just not an excellent game, and it lacks the player freedom I crave in a VR game. Into the Radius is a game I just made a review of, if you're interested in hearing me talk about it extensively. Top right corner to watch it, and go give me views. Yeah, Into the Radius. It has a lot to it. And if Boneworks wasn't considered an indie game, which it is, Into the Radius would be the best indie VR game ever made. It has the player freedom, the immersion, the deep and rich gameplay and level of detail, the runtime that complements its VR price tag. It's an extremely enjoyable title that is heavily underrated, and it's more immersive than Alyx, so easy recommend. And it's on Quest 2 and PC, so it's accessible to everybody. Last but not least, it's one you probably didn't expect at all, and that's Walkabout Mini Golf. It's a simple mini golf in VR, but it has great multiplayer, a fun scavenger hunt in each and every course, a lot of courses, all very interesting, and a very good price. It's very ironic how a mini golf game is one of the best VR games ever, but it is. Good game. So those are the only dedicated 4 VR games that I can even say are worth buying. I guess The Room VR is okay, and Pavlov, while very shallow, is extremely fun. But there isn't a whole lot to justify the steep purchase of getting a VR headset. But now, the technical stuff. The future of VR and how it can be improved from where it already is. First off, gloves. We need gloves to become both good and accessible. Like $100-$150 max for a pair. Gloves would be the permanent replacement for controllers, but they're really just not there yet. But Lucas from Lucid VR is proving that while progress is indeed slow, it is absolutely far from stagnant. Next up, treadmills, and yeah, I know I'm just gonna sound like a Ready Player One fan, but look, okay, VR has been a thing since the Virtual Boy and before that, and I'm sure when you were a kid, you would have killed to live inside Minecraft. Even if Ready Player One didn't inspire the VR scene to progress in the direction it's heading, I'm pretty sure it would have drifted into that direction inevitably. So like I said, treadmills. That would be the ideal compensation for gloves replacing controllers. If you have gloves instead of a controller, then you lack buttons and a joystick. So walking would therefore have to be literal walking. Now, yes, this will make lazy people who are, let's be honest, the majority of VR players, very upset. Having to walk miles in real life just for fun. But wouldn't that be more immersive? Isn't the entire point of virtual reality just to be a more immersive method of playing video games? Isn't the entire point realistic immersion? Okay, let's make a theoretical situation. If you're into the radius and you see a massive factory in the distance, you think, alright, well I gotta walk over there. You just hold your joystick down while you stand in place in real life. And when you get there, you wouldn't care about the journey. But if you had to physically trick your brain into believing you are walking miles and miles to get to your destination that is constantly in sight but considerably far away, the satisfaction of reaching your destination believing you just trekked that distance would be ridiculously pleasurable and satisfying. Now yes, technically treadmills are already a thing, but they're extremely expensive, they're conceptually limited, and they're not as good as they could be. Jumping as high as possible in a game in person would be a little weird being strapped to a treadmill, but one can be designed to have that in mind. VR visors have pretty much gotten as realistic and good looking as they can get. Half-Life Alyx is really as good as VR games can even look. But sprinkles of salt. The seasoning. The meal's already been made, there just needs a little seasoning. And the seasoning is, well, treadmills and gloves and accessories for VR. Those are the next step for VR. VR as a concept, structurally, has been made, but it can be improved in so many ways, both conceptually and in practice. It just makes sense being able to walk in the fictional world you're inside of and touch and grab and feel as if it's real. But even if graphics look like real life, textures appropriately simulated, and body presence is perfected, I personally don't believe that virtual reality will ever become anything more than a gimmick. A different way to play video games than the traditional method. It works really well for some things, don't get me wrong. VR shooters are significantly better than flat screen because reloading is wonderful to do and aiming feels very natural with no need to aim down sights. Horror is perfect for VR, taking advantage of peripheral vision, the sense of palpable scale. Later haptics, like imagine having your shoulder tapped or having breath down your neck. Man, horror is just a genre that would work so much better in VR than it does in traditional flat screen gaming. Just a simple thing like looking down a staircase and seeing how far and dark it is, and just aiming your flashlight in a different direction than you're looking. It's just so much more terrifying in all the right ways. Shooters and horror just work really well, but I mean, some things don't. Platformers, for one. First-person platformers really just don't tend to be that good, and they work better either being 2D or third-person, and it'd be bound to make people throw up. Slow or standard-paced shooters like Half-Life or Counter-Strike would work well in VR, you know. They have translated well, but fast shooters like Doom and Ultra Kill would be miserable to play in VR. The whiplash fast-paced gameplay would not translate to a naturally slower way of playing games. The fast precision of a mouse and keyboard necessary to play Ultra Kill can't be translated in VR in the slightest. Actually, recreating the speed you are in Ultra Kill would be really headache-inducing, and 2D and top-down just don't work. Now, this incompatibility with game genres translating poorly to VR can be fixed by 3 different methods. Number 1 is to play a game on a virtual fake TV in VR and have haptic gloves be indescribably incredible and be able to simulate the feeling that you're holding a controller in your hands, while in real life you're just holding thin air. 2, do the same thing but link a controller to the game and use that with your bare hands. Or 3, play the game in real life. Like you should. All these methods are possible, but even if option 1 and 2 seemed more appealing in the grand scheme of things, I'd personally just prefer option 3. Also, VR games are all digital, and digital games, well, they don't tend to last very long. I'm a game collector. I buy exclusively physical games when I'm able to, and that way I can play them 30 years later with my save files preserved, no need of emulation. But VR is extremely exclusively digital. I can't get a physical copy of Boneworks, and I never will. I don't know if VR will ever introduce physical copies of the scene, but I heavily doubt it because physical PC games are a thing of the past, and the objectively best place to play VR is using Steam, you know, with PC. While VR doesn't have a ton to improve upon as of 2019, it still has some aspects to it that are in its infancy state. The library is just genuinely pathetic, for one. But in terms of graphics and hardware, hey, it's come a very long way. But I do believe that VR needs to head in the direction of touch, which would allow you to walk and grab things. Treadmills really don't have any downsides, and I would love to see them improve and go under $200, and gloves are on their way to becoming a permanent replacement to traditional plastic controllers, but VR itself as a whole is perfectly fine where it is, and I quite frankly don't believe it will ever grow to become anything more than it already is at this point. There's too many cons to it replacing flat screen gaming forever that haven't really been considered, and wearing a headset regardless of its weight and comfortability will get uncomfortable at some point. While VR may never replace flat screen gaming or become superior to it, I still find it to be an extremely neat and impressive concept that has grown exponentially in only a decade and still has quite a bit left to go. I believe in VR, I always have. However, it's always been sort of a gimmick to me, and I think it always will be, but to say the least, a nice gimmick at that.